What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 195. I'm the co-host Kyle Anzalone, joined by Connor Freeman today. Connor, how you doing?
I'm great, Kyle. What's up? How are you?
Good. Glad to have you back on the show because we got a lot to cover. Of course, Connor, you're bad, so we got update on the Iran nuclear deal talks, and we're talking China, including a fear-mongering pro-war piece from Reason that I want to get into and break down. So a lot to talk about on today's show, a lot of important news. Everybody, please share the show. You find it at the Libertarian Institute, and that's also where you find all of Connor's articles. He should have one out in the coming days on the U.S. relationship with Russia and China. That's very important. Great article. Since I work at the Institute, I get the privilege of reading it before some of the rest of you. But yeah, that will be out soon. It's a fantastic piece. So keep on the featured article section at the Institute, but also check out the news roundup that I write every day and also the show. You could also find the show on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey. And then we post on our social media accounts at Facebook and Twitter. You could donate directly to the show at Patreon or Subscribestar, and the information for crypto is in the show notes page. You'll also find all the information about our sponsor, Paloma Verde, in the show notes page. Paloma Verde CBD is the URL. The promo code is PEACE. PEACE. That'll save you 25% off when you spend $75 or more. They have a fantastic selection of products at Paloma Verde. They don't, just sell like the gummies or something like that. They have the higher dose like tinctures or soft gels. You can also get all kinds of topicals. They even have products for your dog. All their products are lab tested to ensure they're absolutely top quality, and they are what they say they are. They pair their CBD with great other things like curcumin or melatonin to enhance the benefits that you get from CBD, or like they put menthol in their sports cream that helps relieve pain and smells absolutely fantastic. So whatever you got going on, probably something you could help yourself with at Paloma Verde. Again, just use the promo code PEACE when you check out. Help out the show. Get yourself a discount. All right, Connor, let's get into it and start discussing some important news that we have out today. And this first is an investigative piece from Reuters where they interview 80 plus people from, I think, what they say over a dozen nations. And the point of this piece is to highlight that Taiwan has been building in trying to, I guess, develop the ability to produce domestically at least assembled submarines. And so as this article gets into, the Taiwan has interacted with at least 7 nations in order to get to the point where I guess they feel fairly close to being able to starting to assemble 8 domestically produced modern conventional submarines. Now, one of the important things, and I guess one of the issues that Taiwan runs into is, of course, if you have like a nuclear powered submarine, you have to have fairly highly enriched uranium to be able to run those. I think they actually run on 90% enriched uranium, or at least 60. And so the US, that all they produce is the nuclear submarines, and so we can't sell Taiwan those because that would be way too provocative to put that kind of technology with Taiwan, as we saw with the reaction, say, to the AUKUS treaty, where this technology is going to go to Australia. And then there really isn't another country that's willing to sell Taiwan any conventionally made submarines. France produces those, Norway produces those. In fact, 2 of the 4 submarines that Taiwan currently has, its 2 bigger and more modern submarines, their Sea Dragons, are actually made by Norway, and then Norway continues to maintain those. So this article outlines and says that both the United States and the UK have shipped portions of the submarines, or at least have promised to Taiwan. The US has given combat system components and sonar, so this seems to be more high-tech pieces. The UK's role is a little bit more obscured, but a lot of it seems to go through this Gibraltar based company. And for people who don't know, The last time this like little territory came up was, of course, when an Iranian ship was seized going into the Mediterranean Sea. But if you look at like the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea coming from the Atlantic Ocean, part of what hangs off the bottom of Spain is actually a UK colony, Gibraltar. And so this is one of the most highly vaccinated places in the world and all this, but it's also a place where a company was set up called, let me see here, Gavron Limited, and it was set up in 2013. And one of the things that it has done is helped Taiwan obtain the needed technical expertise to actually build the submarines, because they're getting sonar from the US. I don't know what they're getting from the UK and everything, but to put all this together and make a functional submarine is kind of complicated if they're not getting the actual design plans from another country. And so they're trying to acquire the people they need to do that. And one of the main people putting this together is the UK Commandant Ian McGhee, Gee spelled McGhei. So he seems to be a pretty important figure in all of this. Now, the information you get in the article, this seems like a pretty official release to me, Connor. It doesn't seem like this was like a scoop that the Taiwanese government was particularly uncomfortable with, even though since this project started after the current Taiwanese leader, President Tees, won election in 2016 is when they started putting this together. There's only a few people within even the Taiwanese government that have been briefed on it and everything. However, now it seems they're pretty ready to come full circle with this and just come out and let people know that, hey, we're going to have this technology. So I guess the reason that Taiwan sees this as important is because they're hoping to deploy these submarines east of the Taiwanese island, and their hope is that the deep water there, the Chinese subs won't be able to get into, and this would give them some kind of advantage tactically to be able to essentially have these assets hidden there, to retaliate if China should attack. And so, this is just really interesting, Connor. Of course, you have countries like South Korea, Australia, India, Spain, and Canada also helping out, although it's not exactly clear what kind of services all these countries are providing. But with this project, and it does, seem somewhat of an official, like, Western project to help Taiwan get these submarines. My guess is that China will find some way to counter this. Maybe they're going to develop some kind of new submarine or nuclear package with Russia. Maybe they look and put a whole bunch of their own money into developing submarine detecting technology. But at this point, Taiwan feels that it will give them a military edge once they're able to complete this project, which again has been carried out in secret up until this point. They talk about having a low profile strategy because if other countries were building submarine packages, like helping Cuba build submarines, the U.S. would be sanctioning them. And so obviously, China is going to be upset and try to exert pressure on various countries who are helping Taiwan with this project. But again, now that it's coming more open, I guess they feel pretty comfortable that they're going to be able to manage this. One last thing to note is the debate within Taiwan was whether to build these submarines, which submarines are fairly expensive technology. And while they do provide a real benefit to being, very hard to detect and very good, if you strike us, we could fire back with our submarines. This is kind of famously what Ron Paul's idea is, get rid of two legs of the nuclear triad and keep the nuclear submarines, at least at this point, So, there's that, but they also point out that, hey, having mobile missile launchers and anti-ship missiles could be a more effective agile deterrent against China and come at a far cheaper cost. And this does wreak somewhat of like a military industrial complex issue here, Connor, where you just have a lot of money being poured into this kind of project, where again, the mobile missile launchers could be cheaper and easier to operate and maintain and all that. So yeah, I think that about covers all the importance here. I guess I'll also mention that Taiwan's other two submarines. So again, they have the two Sea Dragons, which are newer. They have two U.S. Guppy class submarines. I didn't look up much about them. This article describes them as World War II vintage. I'm sure they have plenty of upgrades on them and everything like that, modern computers. But I'm not exactly sure what those look like or how much use they could be, if Taiwan did get into some kind of exchange with China. So yeah, that was I thought a pretty interesting article here, Connor. Though I don't know if you had anything else on any important details that I might have missed.
No, just that this has actually been advocated for. I mean, not specifically this project, but now that they're doing it more out in the open, it means that it'll probably just be supported more by, we keep seeing senators come out and proposing all kinds of deals about yearly aid packages they want to start giving to Taiwan for their military. And like you said, just major boon for the military industrial complex. But there was this new report that came out from the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, an annual report to Congress. And it was pretty hawkish. They're talking about, giving Biden the power to, prohibit American investment in specific Chinese business entities, and give Biden the power to prohibit critical supply chain relationships with China. But one of the things that they say is that Congress should, quote, take urgent measures to strengthen the credibility of U.S. military deterrence in the near term, including prioritizing the delivery of weapons to Taiwan and deploying more cruise and ballistic missiles to the Indo-Pacific. So, of course, it's just
Yeah, I want to mention one thing about this report, Connor, and why I think it's kind of important. And that is Congress, I don't think they really know a whole lot about China. Like, we just recently had 5 lawmakers go to Taiwan this week. And I'm not even sure they understand, like, why China would protest their visiting Taiwan or anything like that. We had Elise Stolken, who probably does understand what she's doing. But then you also had Mark Takano, Nancy Mace, Colin Allred, and Sarah Jacobs all also attend the trip. Yeah, I think Mace was the one that made it bipartisan, right? Because I think the
honorary Republican.
Yeah, got to make the trip bipartisan. So, I'm not even sure they really understand why, these things are so provocative. But, they have those reports, and then that's all they really have. That's all they really know about China, right? They just know what's in that stupid little report that some hawks wrote that work for think tanks and also get a paycheck from Congress. And so I think these things have a lot more potency. And if you look and read these reports, you'll often find in coming weeks that you'll hear members of Congress say things that somebody who skimmed the report read, not somebody who really understood it, but somebody who sat there and was like, oh, China bad, Uyghur, Taiwan straight, air defense identification zone. And then they'll have an interview on Fox News or MSNBC and say all those slogan and keywords.
CCP bad.
Yep. All right. I had a couple other stories I just wanted to mention, Connor. The commander of the 7th Fleet, this is Vice Admiral Carl Thomas, is calling for more U.S. aircraft carriers in the Pacific. So, right now, I think Russia has 1 or 2 kind of functioning aircraft carriers. China, I think, has 1 old Russian Soviet aircraft carrier, 1 domestically produced. And so, the U.S. has 10 or 11 right now aircraft carriers. So obviously we outnumber the aircraft carriers by quite a bit. But this admiral is saying that really what we need is at least 4 aircraft carriers in the Pacific, which is a lot. I remember a few years ago, I think 2017, when tensions with North Korea were very high, and Trump had the Reagan and then I think 2 of the smaller aircraft carriers also deployed to the region. This was seen as a big deal. And so right now, the vice admiral is asking for 4, but he then goes on to say, 4 is great, but with such a big space, 6, 7, 8 would even be better. That's actually what he says. So,
Oh my God.
they're asking for 8 aircraft carriers in the Pacific. Now, one of the important things about that, Connor, is the way the military kind of conducts its navy is that it has like 3. So let's say it has 9 aircraft carriers. Like 3 would be considered like out and on active duty. 3 would be like import on standby, able to go out if needed, but potentially like getting minor upgrades and servicing. And then you would have the other 3 that are getting like full upgrades and servicing, like not available to go out and fight a war at that time. Like, maybe they month or so they get it ready, but those ships are like in dry dock and stuff. And so, or I don't know if they put the full aircraft carriers in dry dock, but they definitely like take them out of commission for a time to like do all the upgrades that need to be done. These are gigantic ships that have so much that needs to be done, particularly with the propulsion systems and all that. So if he's asking for 8, that's really 24, I think, by the way the Navy math works. And that's just for the Pacific. This is an insane number of aircraft carriers they're talking about, especially when you have people such as Lyle Goldstein, who used to work at the Naval War College, even saying that these things are outdated. They're floating targets. He says the best thing is that the ships are kind of like durable, and so they could take a couple hits. Well, the problem is that if you take a hit on an aircraft carrier, you now have 5,000 something hostages floating in the middle of the ocean, and so anytime you go to rescue them, those ships all become targets too, very easy targets of any anti-ship missiles. And so it's not very simple to just say like, oh, we're going to have this powerful fleet of aircraft carriers. Those aircraft carriers could actually become massive liabilities should any actual fighting break out.
And can we imagine like what the domestic reaction would be? Just the domestic reaction would be if you lost, say, to deter whatever China is anticipating, they shoot one aircraft carrier with like one of those ship killer missiles, you lose 6,000 sailors right there.
Yeah.
That's, 2 9/11s in one shot. And I know I was just listening to Peter Van Buren recently talk on the Scott Horton show, and he's talking about how he says we regularly have 2 aircraft carriers based in the Pacific these days, and the British are deploying 2 super carriers there pretty soon as well. So, it's just we're continuing the encircling of China, but it's coming at this rapid pace. And then in the meantime, you have like Jake Sullivan coming out and saying, well, we don't want a Cold War. We want to manage the competition. Let's keep it together. So is it just a corporate welfare scheme, and we're pretending we're going to go to war? We're going to go to war and sail, warships to the Taiwan Strait, or you can't do that to people. I mean, this whole policy with Russia, it's you can't constantly threaten another country with attack and expect everybody to just stay cool. It's ridiculous. It leads to this kind of ridiculous, this admiral postulating that, oh, well, we could have 8. Why not? If we have 4, why not 8? Double it.
Another issue too is that whenever you have an aircraft carrier, it's not just an aircraft carrier, it's an aircraft carrier battle group. And so this includes guided missile destroyers, it includes support ships and other frigates, amphibious assault ships. There's, a lot of other like firepower that comes along with one of these aircraft carriers. And, while Americans aren't typically aware of that, the Chinese are.
Early on in Biden's administration, he sent 2 aircraft carrier strike groups and started doing war drills in the South China Sea, in a major message right at the beginning.
Yeah.
Very early on.
I want to mention quickly, Connor, that a U.S. destroyer made a port call in New Zealand. This doesn't happen very often, and while New Zealand is technically a part of a treaty with the U.S., and I believe Australia is the other member, there are some issues because of New Zealand's non-nuclear position, and so like only a few U.S. ships could actually visit New Zealand ports because I don't think any of the ships that are nuclear propulsion can actually, by the way, New Zealand law works actually go do a port call. But this does signal that New Zealand is somewhat still on board with the general U.S. military mission, the enforcing the rules-based international order, which even the Pentagon admits is just anti-China lingo. Also, want to mention quickly that Japan is increasing its defense spending to a whopping 1.14% of its GDP. So, for all the the U.S. needs to build up in the Pacific and everything, when you actually look at this spending of the countries that are supposed to be the ones that are in the crosshairs of China, their defense spending is absolutely dwarfed by the U.S. and really isn't that much compared to their own GDP. Japan's defense spending will come in at $53 billion, and of course, this is less than 10% of what the U.S. is going to spend. So I don't know. It always seemed to me, Connor, that it is a pretty important and transparent argument that if these countries are really concerned about China, they'd probably be spending a little bit more time and money on their own militaries. I think you wanted to mention that the Pentagon did a review and decided they wanted to upgrade a couple of bases.
Yeah. So they just released the global posture review for the overall, Pentagon military posture around the world. One of the things that, so one of the things that comes with the Asia pivot, of course, is the idea is that they're shifting 2/3 of all air and naval forces to East Asia. Now, a lot of, as we've talked about on the show, a lot of regional actors in the Middle East have begun to, negotiate with each other and try and find diplomatic solutions to long standing issues between them, especially the adversaries like even Iran and Saudi Arabia, because after Biden withdrew from Afghanistan and they've pulled, missile defenses out of Saudi Arabia, people think that they're leaving, regional actors believe that the U.S. is getting ready to start really shifting its assets for the most part over to the what they call the Indo-Pacific. Although this report suggests that that's not exactly true, that they are still planning on, of course, fighting wars in the Middle East, that there's no real intent to leave Syria and Iraq or Africa, of course, and they're still going to be surrounding Russia with NATO forces and building all and militarizing areas near Russia's border. However, they are looking to improve bases in Guam and Australia so that they can, what they basically to counter China. And they still say that China is the pacing challenge and that the Asia Pacific is their what they call priority theater. But they are basically what they're doing is they're going to focus on airfields so they can better transport troops in and out of the bases and also expand storage for weapons and ammunition. And they're trying to make it more conducive for regular deployments and, of course, for, an eventual or potential conflict. Let's see. They also, of course, say that they want to build up more cooperation. I mean, we assume this, but more cooperation with allies in the region and to build up further forces to counter China.
All right, Karen, we got the UK MI6 saying that China is that agency's single greatest priority as well. And guess what? They're a couple months behind the CIA in making this big announcement. But what's coming along with it? What do you think is the big deal here?
Well, essentially, it's really more. It's very ironic because when William Burns announced the new China Mission Center a couple months ago, I believe it was the new ambassador to the new Chinese ambassador to the U.S. who came out and said, why don't you drop your James Bond theatrics already? But now we have actually MI6 coming out and saying that China is their main priority, the greatest threat. Although they also said, and this is also notable for the Iran talks, that the big four security challenges facing them right now are China, Russia, Iran, and terrorism. And as far as China goes, they said that a miscalculation from China, this is Moore, I should say, the head of MI6, Richard Moore, he says a miscalculation from China concerning America's power could very easily lead to a war. He said, quote, Beijing believes its own propaganda about Western frailties and underestimates Washington's resolve. The risk of Chinese miscalculation through overconfidence is real. And he said China is a, quote, authoritarian state with different values than ours. And also said some more stuff about how Russia is an acute threat to the international rules-based system, more of that same boilerplate rhetoric we were talking about earlier. And he said that, with everything going on right now in Eastern Europe and on Russia's border, he says we and our allies and partners must stand up to and deter Russian activity, which contravenes the international rules-based system.
All right, Connor, I want to move on real quick and talk about this article from Reason, which is, of course, one of the main libertarian outlets. And while the Cato is probably known a little bit better for foreign policy, if people are reading libertarian kind of more mainstream, Reason's one of the places to go. And so when they run an article on that just pushes China war propaganda. The title of the article is "Terror Washing a Genocide." It's by Ben Mock, who I haven't read before. Reason. Typically, their foreign policy is like Eric Boeheim or Fiona Harang, who I usually think are fantastic. So, that's one of the reasons I want to talk about it. And also because I think it's a good chance to just remind people that these reports from the Newlines Institute are absolute trash. And so what this piece is it's from Sean Roberts, who wrote a book claiming that China has basically, covered up its cultural genocide of the Uyghurs through saying that, there's terrorism and everything like that. And so one of the things that, Roberts, of course, really relies on, he's the co-author of the report from the Newlines Institute, the Uyghur genocide, along with Adrian Zenz. And what they rely on is breakdowns from Adrian Zenz that claims that a decline in Uyghur birth rate is due to a Chinese genocide. But as Gareth Porter and Mads Blumenthal explained in a piece from the Gray Zone earlier this year, you have to look and really bend the truth to believe this. They point out that a lot of the decline in birth rate is due to the fact that Uyghur women have an increased access to birth control. And so when there's no birth control, women tend to have a lot more babies than when there are. Now, feminists, I think, would typically promote this and say it's a great thing because it's, putting less burden on the woman and allowing her to have options outside of just being a mother. And I'm pretty sure that's the point that the editors at Reason would make if, let's say, there was like any kind of American, or they were just looking at Adrian Zenz's beliefs that, women, I think should be more in the home and like shouldn't be taking birth control. You also have Zenz.
I think Zenz has said that gender equality is part of Satan's plot.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, he is
along with like
homosexuality,
very
like pro-Christian, like zealot type. He isn't like saying like the Jews will burn because of Hitler. He's saying the Jews will burn because they haven't accepted
converted
Jesus into their lives and stuff like this. Very anti-gay.
He said, I think, in the rapture that if they didn't already convert, they would be refined in a fiery furnace.
Right. So that's who Adrian Zenz is.
He fits in well with the Reason crowd.
Yeah, that's, this is the person that all the work that, Roberts and others are doing on the Uyghur issue, a lot of it, almost all of it, is based off of Zenz. And so, and it's not only that, it's also that a very minor look at Roberts would take you to the Newlines Institute, and just basic looking at the Newlines Institute should get you to the article published in the Grade Zone earlier this year on this institute. That was it's just absolutely defunct. Almost, none of their students are getting the kind of education they're supposed to get. There's been questionable as far as the Fairfax University of America, which New Lines Institute is, teachers weren't qualified to teach their assigned courses. And so why the hell would you be citing people who work with the institute attached to this organization? And it just goes to show, I think, kind of the fundamental problem, and that is too few libertarians know who Gareth Porter is, right? Because if you knew who Gareth Porter is, you wouldn't have fallen for this. And Reason did. And I think it's actually going to be in like their December print issue. Oh, two more things I'll mention on this. One thing in the article that was a major red flag to me pretty early in the paragraph is like first or second paragraph. They called the Uyghurs the most surveilled people in the world, which there may be a lot of surveillance of the Uyghurs, not saying there isn't, but to say that after it was just uncovered that Israel was spying on Palestinian human rights, leaders and members of, organizations that they later labeled a terrorist group. And when you look at the amounts, like the fact that, they've recently exposed this Blue Wolf program where the Israeli soldiers, the IDF soldiers, were going around the West Bank taking pictures of absolutely everyone they possibly could. Kind of a stupid thing to say. And, it's just, trying to say, oh, Saddam Hussein is the worst human rights violator in the world. This is the same kind of worst state, propaganda that it's garbage. It's not an actual statement. It's just meant to rile up Americans against the Chinese Communist Party. And then the last thing I'll mention is that CNN also did a review of this very same book and did not put genocide in the title of their article. And that really probably isn't on the author. That's on the editors at Reason, and that's really problematic to me. That they're sticking genocide in the title of their articles, and so I don't know if anybody from Reason would want to talk about it. I'm more than willing to like have them on to the show or something like that. I talk about Reason articles all the time. Typically, it's because they're absolutely great, but this was atrocious and just straight up war state propaganda. And from if they're like giving a positive review to some guy who works at like West End Zets or something like that, obviously people identify that as worst state propaganda, but here it's just because China's bad and everybody goes along with China bad, including the independent media. We have this very unfortunate thing going on here. Connor,
I'll just add really quick. Zenz is he's part of that Jamestown Foundation, which was founded by Bill Casey, Reagan's director of the CIA. So it's kind of as crazy as if you were talking to somebody from West Exec, which is where I believe Blinken and Michelle Flournoy, that's their military industrial complex consulting firm.
Yeah. All right, Connor, let's move on and start talking about the Iran nuclear deal talks, which have just resumed. These are indirect talks between the United States and the Iranians in Vienna. I believe the way that this is working is the main talks are happening in a hotel conference room between the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, French, Germans, and the British are all there. I'm not sure if there's representatives or observers from any other parties like the IAEA or something like that. And then once they talk to the Iranians, they take what they have. They go a couple blocks over to a different hotel. I understand that the Americans are not staying in the same hotel as the Iranians. And then they tell the Americans what the Iranians said, and they work out a little light thing, and then they take it back to the Iranians. And so I don't know, there's something comical and seemingly really stupid about that, Connor. But at the same time, diplomacy is diplomacy, and obviously, there's a lot of complicated factors here, and there's a reason that the Iranians aren't engaging in direct talks. So just update us, what's going on and any progress, any good news.
Well, so we'll start off with, I'll just say that last Wednesday, the day after our previous show. We knew the talks, we discussed this, and that the talks are going to be restarting on Monday. And so Frank McKenzie of CENTCOM came out and threatened Iran. He said, the diplomats are in the lead on this, but if CENTCOM always has a variety of plans that we could execute if directed. A not hardly veiled threat at all to go to war. And also you had Robert Malley, who is, of course, the special envoy on Iran, sort of leading the American delegation to the talks. And he also said, he was talking about basically being hyperbolic about Iran's nuclear advancements that they've undertaken since all the Israeli sabotage, particularly of this year, and the murder of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the scientist, back in November. And of course, the increasing sanctions under the Biden administration. And so Malley comes out without providing, the context of all that, and says that if they start getting he says to NPR. So McKenzie was talking to Time Magazine, and then Robert Malley said to NPR, if they start getting too close for comfort, then of course we will not be prepared to sit idly. So that was, a horrible way to walk into the talks, and signaled that, of course, that the Americans aren't very serious. But no, so yeah, the talks have resumed. What is going on right now is so they are at the hotel, the Palais Coburg in Vienna, which is where the original agreement was signed in 2015. There's an EU official named Enrique Mora who is chairing the talks. He met with the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians on Sunday, and then met with the Americans, representatives of those previously mentioned states, and then met with diplomats or representatives from Europe, the European countries, the European signatories, Germany, France, and Britain, along with the Americans early Monday, yesterday, before the talks began. And he came out after yesterday, and he said basically he's fairly optimistic about things that are going on. He says that the Iranians have essentially said that they will build off of the previous 6 rounds of talks that were undertaken during the Rouhani administration from April to June, before talks ended for 5 months around the time the current president, Ibrahim Raisi, was elected. He says that the Iranians are, most focused, and they have been saying this as well, that they're most focused on removing the sanctions. His quote was that there is a sense of urgency in putting an end to the suffering of the Iranian people. He said that the Iranian delegation, so I already said that, but he, let's see. So we also had the foreign minister of Iran come out and say that, as I said earlier, they sent the Iranians are focused on lifting sanctions. So the way it works is, yesterday there were sort of preliminary talks, and today the sanctions working group that existed in the first the initial rounds reconvened today to discuss sanctions, and then tomorrow there's a working group on the nuclear issues, and they will be conducting their talks tomorrow. But so we had the foreign minister of Iran come out and say that the United States still fails to properly understand the fact that there is no way to return to the deal without verifiable and effective lifting of all sanctions imposed on the Iranian nation after the U.S. departure. And the lead Iranian negotiator also said that he was optimistic after the conclusion of yesterday's talks. And I'll point out that, some of this stuff is, you have to kind of take some of it with a grain of salt, but there is a report from Axios that says that America is not enthusiastic and has very low expectations for the talks, and that they don't really trust that Iran is serious about negotiations. That's a lot of what I've been seeing in the rhetoric from the Europeans and the Americans. They don't believe Iran is serious about negotiations. So this report from Axios says that senior officials, unnamed of course, in the U.S. intelligence community, have assessed that Ibrahim Raisi thinks his predecessor Rouhani is a weak accommodationist who negotiated a bad deal. And they say that to the extent that there is optimism, it's that Raisi may ultimately be able to negotiate like a new deal, but kind of spin it as his own, that might be similar to the previous deal. But, and that's another thing that you keep seeing, is that there's Enrique Mora, I believe, also is saying that there there's an interest in accommodating the so-called political sensibilities of the Raisi administration, who were, portrayed as being more hardline, although essentially, I mean, so the Americans are coming out and they say things. You'll hear like State Department spokespeople saying things like, if the Iranians want anything more or anything less than a strict compliance for compliance agreement, this isn't going to work essentially. And but that's all sort of in the eyes of the beholder, because what the Iranians are saying is that they do support that. As I quoted earlier from the foreign minister, they do want a serious deal where they both come back to full compliance. Although what the Iranians are saying is that they want to be compensated. When they say that they want the Americans to take responsibility for abrogating the deal in 2018, that means that they want to be compensated. So that there is a quote from I'll have to find it, but there's a quote from one of the Iran. I don't remember if it was Katiz Beta, the foreign ministry spokesman, or I'll see if I can find it as I'm looking through this stuff. But essentially what he says is, look, a deal's a deal. And in any other situation, in any other business, if you break your end of your obligations and you break the deal, you owe the other party compensation. So, and he says, and that's how it works. So they want to be made whole again. I'm sure that'll be discussed, but essentially they also want, basically, as what have been their demands all along, that the Americans can provide them a guarantee that they won't leave the deal again, and that they can verify sanctions relief. And in exchange for that, of course, even though, as we've discussed, that's sort of tenuous, because Biden's administration has been so reluctant to provide such a guarantee that even hypothetically they've said that they wouldn't be able to do it. Which was a huge issue, and Trita Parsi reported on that a month or two ago. That is still basically what Iran is saying, that they would return to full compliance if the Americans did the same and compensated them for the economic damage of the maximum pressure campaign. So let's see now. So the Iranians are very proud that they're calling it a major achievement that they were able to discuss sanctions first. I've got some quotes from some different experts that were quoted in a Middle East Eye article, let's see, called Vienna, Iran Nuclear Talks Raise Hopes of Return to Compliance. They interviewed Sina Tusi, who is a senior research analyst at the National Iranian American Council. He says the initial signs coming out of Vienna after the Joint Commission meeting ended today are positive. The very low bar that many people had going into these talks has been significantly surpassed. I don't think there's going to be a breakthrough anytime soon. I think the Iranians are going to make the U.S. sweat. And then they interviewed someone named Nasayan Rafati, who's the Iran senior analyst at an organization called the Crisis Group. And he says there is still a potential for reviving the agreement. Largely depends on how much each side is willing to concede. I think in part it will depend on what the U.S. is willing to put on the table in the form of sanctions relief, what the Iranians are, what they will accept in order to bring their nuclear program back into parameters with the 2015 agreement. Let's see. So they also interviewed a guy named Saeed Hussein Mousavian, who's a nuclear policy specialist at Princeton and former head of Iran's National Security Foreign Relations Committee. And he said that returning to compliance would be easy for Iran. They were in full compliance for 3 years, of course, from 2016 to 2019, for a full year after the U.S. Unilaterally and illegally left the deal and then reimposed sanctions. And only then did they start, which they're permitted to under the Articles 26 and 36, start to walk back their obligations to put, to gain leverage to bring the Americans back to the table. Let's see. So, and then the guy from the Crisis Group just basically said that Iran's demand for the U.S. to lift all sanctions is a potential landmine. I think he means a political landmine. It might be an insurpassable hurdle because, as he says, all of the 1,500 or so sanctions the Trump administration put in place, a lot of those are not just strictly part of the nuclear deal. And so the American policy is basically that we will, that they will only lift sanctions that are so-called inconsistent with the deal. But that leaves quite a few sanctions that deal with things like human rights and terrorism, et cetera, still on the table. And Iran would like to see those lifted. And, they want to see all of Trump's sanctions lifted. So let's see what else I have. So as far as other things coming out of the talks, we have, the line I was quoting earlier is from Iran's top nuclear negotiator Ali Bagheri Khani, and he said in a column for the Financial Times that the West needs to pay a price for having failed to uphold its part of the bargain. As in any business, a deal is a deal, and breaking it has consequences. Um, and so yes, and they have a delegation at these talks of 40 different people that Iran has brought to the talks, and many of them include economic experts and economic officials, I should say, reflecting their focus on removing sanctions. Let's see.
So,
Yeah, I
Connor,
also. Oh,
I
please
wanted
go
to
ahead.
ask you about the IAEA, if we could.
Yeah.
And apparently, there were some overly invasive inspections when the IAEA reached Iran, or at least this is the accusation from the Europeans. And I don't know. Do you have any details on this? I mean, you know, I would kind of get it, I guess, if the Iranians feel a little paranoid. There have been some pretty mysterious positive samples found in Iran over the years. But at the same time, if you're like a scientist who works for the IAEA and some, you know, IRGC commander gets a little grabby around your genitals, that could also be a pretty uncomfortable situation as well. So I'm just wondering if we have any idea what's going on here, if this is just the Europeans being jerks.
Well, I think it's partially that because uh, they haven't really been very honest actors at all in all of this because they're always calling out Iran for their so-called violations of different agreements, and that like I said, them saying that you're not very serious about this, and you have the British, I want to say foreign minister who just met with Yair Lapid, the Israeli foreign minister, on Monday, coming out and saying things like, Iran, this is your last chance. If this fails, we will look at all options on the table, and this sort of rhetoric. And the Germans, of course, didn't want America to unfreeze the $10 billion in frozen assets they were requesting initially as a show of goodwill. It is their money, of course, and before these talks began. So, and the French have likewise been, kind of throwing cold water on some of the they've kind of dampened optimism on the outcome of these, for months on the outcome of these sort of talks and negotiations. But so yeah, so basically they're saying, and we'd heard stuff about this before, that there was some so-called, I believe it was the accusation was that there was sexism or something, shown towards certain IAEA inspectors on the part of the Iranians. But as you say, we discussed this on the show a while back. I forget what the name of the site is, but there was a site that I think you were just referring to, where you said mysterious positive samples. And it gets brought up every once in a while to give Iran a headache. But it was a site that they claim hasn't been active or wasn't ever a site where they were doing nuclear work. But they had found, I forget, it's some minuscule amount or specks of stuff like uranium material or nuclear material, and there was suspicions that the IAEA had actually somehow put that there. Now, as Jason says here as well, that they've had a problem with, of course, the sabotage attacks, and the IAEA has been reluctant to call out Israel for their attack on the Karaj site where IAEA cameras were destroyed, and nevertheless, they continue to chastise Iran for not allowing them in there to replace the cameras, even though Iran always says, well, if you condemn Israel in their attack when they destroyed your stuff, we'll let you in. You can do whatever you want. So there's some hypocrisy there, but basically they're saying that they're, as you say, inappropriately touching inspectors in their searches, getting them to remove certain articles of clothing. But yeah, as Jason says, that they have a longstanding mistrust of this organization, and of course they've also been saying things about how the IAEA has a strong Western bias, that they're funded by the powerful nations, and that they just kind of play their role politically for the Americans. And this was stated recently because at the Board of Governors meeting last week. the Americans came out and made a statement. This guy, Louis Bono, who's one of the U.S. envoys in Vienna, said if Iran's non-cooperation is not immediately remedied, the board will have no choice but to reconvene an extraordinary session before the end of the year in order to address the crisis. And this is over the fact that they have not re-implemented the additional protocol, which was an aspect of the JCPOA that allowed snap inspections by the IAEA at any time, in order to induce some substantive diplomacy on the part of the Americans and to disincentivize these Israeli attacks. The parliament had initially ordered, why don't you just kick the inspectors out? But that was moderated by the government, and they said that they would have this sort of interim deal, the monitoring deal with the IAEA, but that ultimately expired before any breakthrough was made in talks. So there hasn't been any reason for the Iranians to, since this can be used as leverage, to sort of, work this out with the IAEA anytime soon. So they just continue to use this rhetoric as a way to sort of paint Iran as the stubborn figure in all of this. But the Russian envoy came out and said, I don't welcome this particular statement of the U.S. delegation. It's not helpful. The U.S. did not negotiate with the Iranians for a very long time and forgot that the Iranians don't do anything under pressure. If they are under pressure, they resist. He also said that this will hurt, the talks coming up with this was, of course, last week. So he said this would be a bad thing to do, of course, right before talks resumed. And then, yes, the spokesman for Iran's Atomic Energy Organization said that they have this Western bias. They're under the influence of the powerful countries who finance them. And then in turn, they apply pressure on Iran.
So, Connor, one of the things with the talks that I've been pretty pessimistic. Anybody who listens to the show knows that. Initially, I was a little bit optimistic being Biden's turn. Maybe he'll get back in and revive it. Pretty early on, I felt like it wasn't going in that direction. I felt somewhat vindicated by Treated Parsi's reporting on how the Biden administration handled the offers from the Rouhani government of Iran. Of course, now we have the Raisi administration. Now, that being said, Israel is going absolutely ballistic, and if reading between the lines, it seems to me Israel would not be working so hard to undermine the possibility of diplomacy if they weren't really concerned that some kind of diplomacy might actually happen. And so I'm wondering what your take on this is. I'm sure you have a bunch of recent news stories about what Israel is doing and how they're reacting to these talks.
Yeah, so when the talks were initially announced back in April, the original indirect talks in Vienna, as we talked about here previously, Israel attacked a cargo ship, an Iranian cargo ship in the Red Sea. Then when the talks actually began, they attacked the Natanz uranium enrichment facility, which is the main centrifuge building site in Iran. And they caused an explosion, damaged centrifuges, caused power outages. So I was expecting some sort of, covert attack, some sort of sabotage attack to come up. But instead, what they've done, which is interesting, they've gone in I suppose it's kind of in a similar, I think they were trying to get the Iranians to, here it seems like they're trying to foil the negotiations directly by inserting false intelligence and news stories, by creating an information loop. So one of the things that they did is that they've come out immediately and they're saying that, among other things, Iran is preparing. They have intelligence. It might have been Gantz or Lapid that said, I think it's Lapid, that we have indisputable intelligence that shows that Iran is preparing to enrich uranium to 90%, to weapons grade levels. And the funniest thing, too, is if you read some of these articles, and I'll go through the one from Axios, they say that they're doing this for leverage, which is so stupid because everybody knows that if they did that, they would end the talks in like the middle of, the Iranian envoy, introducing himself. If there's no way that would gain them leverage. That would tank the whole negotiation for sure. I would just assume, I assume. So, and they've never sought nuclear weapons before, and they've never enriched uranium to 90%. So as Peter Van Buren says, when he says that he doesn't see any reason to believe China is preparing to really invade Taiwan or to attack Taiwan, he says you need a change event, because for 70 years, they haven't attacked Taiwan. They haven't invaded. So in this case, Iran has never enriched uranium to 90%. So you got to give us a real reason. It seems like right now would be the absolute worst time to do it. So just on that basis, and historically, it's all BS. But so they say in this Axios report that For 2 weeks now, Israel's been sharing intelligence with the U.S. and the Europeans. Like I said, that they're preparing to enrich to 90%. They said that, let's see, that they assess that also, in order to gain leverage, that they will be preparing to attack American forces and their allies with their so-called proxies in Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. Which again doesn't make any sense, but you have Saudi constantly bombing Yemen, and there's this major battle over Marib right now, very critical battle in the war in Yemen, and in the midst of all that, especially recently, there've been a lot of like tit for tat attacks and strikes where the Houthis have been sending drones north over the border into Saudi Arabia at oil facilities and other sites. So they can spin that as the Houthis, being Iranian proxies attacking U.S. allies or whatever. But that's ridiculous. In fact, I even saw something where they were saying that they said to Bahrain, where they were talking about how we keep the Iranians up at night with our new alliance. The Israelis were saying this, our new alliance with the Gulf states. They said something about basically Bahrain sees the drones flying over their skies from Iran hitting Saudi Arabia, which is just completely ridiculous. And they're conflating all these different things, and that's not what's happening. But they again, they're saying, back to this article from Axios, they're saying that basically the Americans are now coming out and also saying that, we're focused on diplomacy, but we're prepared to pursue other options as well. So you have this diplomatic blitz that coincides with this false intelligence op that's coming out, where you have, Yair Lapid, the foreign minister of Israel, visited Boris Johnson in London on Monday and made similar statements to what he said to Emmanuel Macron today in Paris. Basically that if you lift sanctions, that Israel will unilaterally attack Iran, that they're on their path to building a nuclear weapon. It's going to lead to a nuclear arms race. In this particular article, it says that they've assessed I think it says that, U.S. and Israeli intelligence sources put the timeline at 1 or 2 years because they admit that enrichment alone will not produce a bomb. Estimates vary as to how long it would take Iran to master additional technological requirements, and they say 1 to 2 years, but Lapid is going around and saying they're going to have a bomb in 6 months. Let's see. So then, yes, Yair Lapid met with his UK counterpart, Liz Truss, in London. And as I said, they said that this is, we're going to look at other options. This is the Iranians' last chance. And we also have Benny Gantz, a very hawkish Israeli defense minister, will be visiting Washington next week, apparently, to meet with Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, and other senior Biden administration officials. And whenever that happens, it's usually just, more propaganda and more basically, they're going to be very hawkish on Iran and say that we'll never allow Iran to have nukes. And, we've been hearing this rhetoric for weeks now from the Americans. And in fact, even Robert Malley, who's supposed to be the adult in the room, the envoy for the talks, he came out and said that the Iranians better not use these talks as a pretext to expand their program, which, again, is completely contradictory, and it's absurd. But they seem to be sort of almost coordinating with this rhetoric, and the Europeans are saying that they're concerned as well about these different reports, although they admit that they haven't verified them. But it's still, obviously, they're essentially it's the diplomatic equivalent of hitting one of their nuclear sites with an explosion or something. They're also We had, like I said, you had this Liz Truss and Lapid. They came out and issued a public statement saying that they will work together and they're committed to preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, which precipitated Iran's foreign ministry spokesman Saeed Khatibzadeh to come out and say that the Europeans are attempting to delay the lifting of sanctions. But I also picked up in this report from Al Jazeera, which is Iran and the world powers resume Vienna talks to restore the nuclear deal. They talk about all this, but they also say that other members of the Gulf Cooperation Council have welcomed the restoration of the nuclear deal. So it's kind of interesting. I know that Robert Malley went out and met with, as we talked about here, with the Bahrain. He went to Bahrain, the UAE, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. But it seems like even though Bahrain is extreme and UAE are extremely hawkish, uh, they mention here specifically Saudi Arabia, and they have said some better things about how if this deal can prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, that they would support it, which obviously it does. So then, let's see. So, yeah, Lapid just said to Macron essentially this: you must not lift sanctions. Sanctions must be tightened. If anything, more pressure needs to be put on the Iranians. Let's see. They're very concerned that might be some sort of interim deal, which they call a less for less deal. Basically, Sullivan spoke to his counterpart, the Israeli National Security Advisor Eyal Hulada, recently, and was saying how, I believe it was, if Iran agrees to freeze like the enrichment to 60%, the uranium hexafluoride, which they have done in very, very small amounts, and it's precisely to gain leverage for talks. Like there's no other use for 60% enriched uranium for them. And this was the parliament ordered that immediately after the Natanz attack back in April. So, and so basically they're saying if you stop that, or if you freeze that, then we will, I believe they said they would issue waivers for humanitarian trade. And then the main thing is that they would unfreeze certain assets that Iran would like to see unfrozen. So, in other words, neither party gets everything they want, but they get a little bit of something they want. And considering how far apart both parties are here on the talks, as you said, they're not even directly talking to each other. That might be the only path forward, is one of these interim deals. But the Iranians have come out and said that, the Israelis have come out and said that if you do that, it'll be, you'll benefit the hardliners, or you'll embolden the hardliners. But that's, of course, really, really dumb, because at the Israelis' agitation and behest in many ways, the Biden administration totally flubbed their opportunity to rejoin the JCPOA while Rouhani was still president for these first 6 months of the year. In fact, they had even a little bit more time than that, because they could have wrapped it up in the interim between when Raisi was elected and when he actually took office, which I believe was a couple of months. I don't think Raisi actually took office until either very late July or early August. So, yeah, and then as far as the nuclear thing, I'll just say again, speaking about the Europeans, it says in this report from the Jerusalem Post, talking about what Lapid was saying to Macron, it says that France, Germany, and the UK are very sympathetic to Israel's messages. A senior Israeli diplomatic source said, and they say Russia has been attentive. And although there has been some communication with China about this issue, the so-called 90%, they're going to enrich to 90%. The Chinese it said they're not receptive to this. So let's see. So they're also, Naftali Bennett came out, put out a message and saying that don't give in to Iran's nuclear blackmail, a video message. He accused Iran. He says they want to enter negotiations with no intention to roll back the program. They want to end sanctions in exchange for almost nothing, which is, again, ridiculous. This is the most stringent and comprehensive nuclear inspections regime in history. So, and of course, as Dave DeCamp points out often, the Israelis are always complaining, oh, they're enriching too much, their uranium way too much. This is a huge concern, nuclear bombs. But the truth is that the deal would essentially limit their enrichment to 3.67%. So if anything, the Israelis should be the biggest advocate for the JCPOA. But that's, of course, not what this is all about. So, see if there's anything else. Oh, yeah. So the Americans have come out and said that attack you covered here and back in the end of October, this was nearing the time when Iran was they had been saying for a while that the Raisi administration was keen on getting back to the table and to return to these talks. And so after that, the Biden administration did a lot of things that were very hawkish and very aggressive, which reflected their true position. But one of the things that they did was they imposed new sanctions on Iran, and then Israel conducted what American officials, unnamed American military officials, are telling the Times now was an Israeli cyber attack on Iran's gas Basically, they shut down gas pumps across the country for about 2 weeks. As Dave DeCamp says here, Iran provides a certain amount of subsidized fuel to each citizen at a discounted price, and the report said that it took the oil ministry 2 weeks to get the system back up and running. And they wanted to get the Iranians angry and cause a bunch of civil strife, but that didn't actually materialize. And then they claimed the Israelis said that unnamed Israeli officials said that they said that then the Iranians retaliated by hacking, I guess, a medical facility and an Israeli dating site. And that they said that the hackers posted details of millions of Israelis to social media. I don't know. I didn't see look. I mean, that's the first I've heard of that story. So, but this was, as you talked about, when this cyber attack in Iran took place. They put up digital messages that were saying, "Haha," like I think something about "Where is your gasoline, Khamenei?" Blaming the Ayatollah essentially and trying to stir people up. But at the time, I remember you saying this. Most signs here would point to Israel being behind this. And so at least they're basically admitting this. Now, Dave suggests here in his report that this could be, he says the acknowledgement by U.S. officials came just before the U.S. and Iran resumed negotiations. This could be an attempt to increase pressure ahead of talks. And he makes the point that quietly backing Israel's operations against Iran appears to be a negotiation tactic for the Biden administration. Which is interesting because there was a report out in Yahoo recently that said that basically the Trump administration, I think going back to 2018, was trying to get a serious covert war campaign started with Iran. That they were looking for. It was basically going to be psychological war, propaganda war, information war, and sabotage. But the way the story goes here, it sounds like that was not. I don't believe that was implemented because they basically portray Mark Milley and the Joint Staff of the Pentagon, as well as the CIA, as being reluctant to do all of this and getting bogged down in sort of legal peculiarities, and also concerns that this could lead to a war, et cetera, et cetera. But now I don't know how true all of that is. They also referenced that, of course, Trump authorized the CIA to get much more aggressive on cyber attacks I believe it was 2018, and those were sort of deployed against Iran and Russia, especially. That was another report from Yahoo. I forget how long ago that story came out, but they said basically that McKenzie, head of CENTCOM, because this whole program, the CIA didn't really want to do it, so it was going to be a part of Special Operations Command's jurisdiction, and of course CENTCOM, because that's that's Frank McKenzie's territory, so to speak, and so that's his beat. And so now he's a big Iran hawk, and Frank McKenzie, as we know from reading Gareth Porter and his reports at the Gray Zone, that he's got a great one about Frank McKenzie that came out like late last year or early this year. I encourage people to read that. Essentially talks about how he has ginned up with his connections in major media, fake Iranian threats to build, to basically maintain and increase assets, resources, and money for CENTCOM, because he fears that, his concern is that if you think about it, CENTCOM is basically just a government bureaucracy in many ways, and that more resources are being pulled towards Indo-Pacific Com and Eurocom with the focus on great power competition. So it makes sense that McKenzie would have been giddy to get this whole thing going with Iran. And it sounds like he was very frustrated, as well as Trump administration officials were, that they weren't able to get this off the ground. Now, it does seem like toward November, I think they said that or January, very late in Trump's administration, he does get the authorization for this program to start. But they said it would take 6 months for things to really begin. And then it does say here in the beginning of the article that it's not clear if Biden has been, pursuing this policy. Now, what I find very interesting, though, is there's a note here, like a quote from, I think it's a national security advisor for the Middle East and Africa. I forget what her name is, Victoria something. But basically what she says is we were very frustrated, and that the Israelis were chomping at the bit. Let us, go in and do our thing, and we can work with you to do this sabotage. And then it sounds like Trump said to the Israelis, "You go ahead and do this." Now, it's very possible there's a line in here that the Americans said the idea was you do the sabotage, we'll stick to the maximum pressure. That is essentially what the Biden policy has been. So, I mean, it's not exactly clear to me how much of all of this is true, because of what the sourcing is. But I will say, and kind of the narrative seems a little bit just a little bit surprising to me. But I can see certain cooler heads prevailing maybe in the Pentagon establishment who are aware that if you push Iran too far and you do get into some sort of as they talk about here, an escalation ladder situation where things get pretty hairy. The truth is that the American military establishment is reluctant to go to war with Iran for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's huge. It's got 80 million people. They have a very formidable ballistic missile deterrent. They have a latent nuclear deterrent, of course, which is a big part of their leverage. And they have a wide array of asymmetrical capabilities with their allies in the region who can hit myriad American assets, bases, troops, and allies. So, but long story short, I'll just say that I think basically the policy, for all intents and purposes, was just basically America delegating this sabotage campaign over to Israel. I mean, even the stuff that they're talking about, even though that whole cyber attack on the gas didn't really pan out the way they intended, it tracks exactly with what they're trying to do here, which is to create civil unrest, turn the people against their government, sabotage civilian infrastructure, and this sort of thing. So, but it's a very interesting report. I recommend people read it. And again, if that really was authorized toward the end of Trump's administration, that also would make sense, because it really did look in the final days of Trump's administration like he may go ahead and start a war with Iran. I mean, he was arguably one of the most hawkish pro-Israel presidents, maybe the most in history, and was really, in many ways, just following Sheldon Adelson's orders. And that would have been something that Sheldon Adelson certainly would have gotten behind in those sort of interests. And so they were moving, they were flying B-52s over the Persian Gulf constantly and moving like nuclear subs into the Persian Gulf and encircling Iran in a way that they actually don't normally do. It was tensions were extremely high at that point. And of course, the Israelis had killed Fakhrizadeh, and there was a report in BuzzFeed at the time that Trump had handed over his policy on Iran to Elliot Abrams, the arch neocon, who was his envoy, who was putting on new sanctions every single week, and Mike Pompeo, obviously, who's one of the most hawkish secretaries of state we've ever had, and Gina Haspel, the former torturer and then head of the CIA. So things looked really bad at that time, and so I'm not surprised if that's actually what happened, that they went ahead and did this.
All right, Connor. Well, thanks for breaking all that down, and that's probably where we should wrap up the show today. Another great one, Connor. Thanks for doing it again. Everybody follow Connor on Twitter at Freeman's Mind 96, and be sure to have your eye on the Libertarian Institute for his article coming out in the next couple days. Thanks, Connor.
Thank you, Kyle.